or a crisis such as in Ukraine and with Russia's attack, and both of these countries being major backbones of our global food markets, immediately translating into price hikes that we have not seen in a generation. The consequence of this is that literally on the other side of the world, somebody who would yesterday have gone to their local food market and bought the food that they need to feed their family may a day later no longer be in a position to do so. The report, the cost of living crisis report that we have released today, tries to provide the most immediate and available data and analysis to show quite how dramatic this impact has been. We have reviewed data for 159 countries, and we have tried to assess two aspects that I want to briefly highlight. First of all, the impact in terms of poverty, or let me put it in another way, the extraordinary impoverishment of people that we have seen just over the last 3 months. Our report estimates that 71 million people in developing countries have fallen into poverty in just 3 months as a direct consequence of the global food and energy price surges. The impact on poverty rates is in fact drastically faster than even the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the speed with which it is happening. And our report also points to the fact that not everybody is affected equally, depending on how much of your food grains you import, where you import from. The crisis is not hitting all countries alike. There are hotspots in the Western Balkans, Central Asia, the Horn of Africa, and the Sahel region that our report pinpoints, and we share the first-time estimates at country levels for all those countries that we could obtain data for. They do provide a look not only at the potential impact of food and energy price spirals, but actually what has happened over the last 12 weeks. This cost of living crisis is arriving into an extremely fragile context, as the world is also facing the cascading crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. If you look at the news headlines over the last couple of weeks, you will see from across the world yet again the extraordinary impact of droughts, of fires, of floods, not only in terms of what it does to where people live and how they are able to live in the place they call home, but also how it is affecting their households, their livelihoods, their economies. The UN and the international community, the Bretton Woods system, is now challenged to respond to a series of crises that are unfolding simultaneously, and we are struggling to respond. The UN Secretary General has repeatedly called upon particularly the wealthier nations of the world to take action, both in terms of introducing liquidity at the global level to support particularly developing countries in the extraordinary challenge they now face. No fiscal space left, no financing in their budgets after dealing with the COVID pandemic, and now facing the added cost of living spiraling crisis in terms of prices, but also having to deal with a mounting challenge in terms of debt. We estimate that over 80 developing countries are debt vulnerable and are therefore sometimes just a step away from perhaps defaulting on their interest payments and then facing all the consequences that we see so tragically playing out yet again across the world, and the latest reminder being Sri Lanka. But the report also tries to offer insights into how policy responses at the national level and yes, globally can take place. Not all choices are equal. Some policies are fairer and more cost-effective, others less so. Many countries are moving in the direction, for instance, of price-related policies, blanket subsidies, or tax reductions in terms of cost of fuel, which in some ways is an inverted subsidy. However, economists know and agree across all different schools of thought that subsidies are rarely as good as targeted cash transfers. We estimate that targeted transfers more than mitigate all of the global poverty increases when you take the threshold of $1.90 or $3.20 a day, and can mitigate the impact in terms of poverty of these price increases almost 3/4 at a level of $5.50 a day. These are important insights that should guide us in how we respond to this crisis. Blanket energy subsidies, for example, might help in the short term. In the longer term, they actually drive inequality and further exacerbate the climate crisis. We estimate that energy subsidies disproportionately benefit wealthier people. This is not new, but in the context of the current crisis, extremely important to consider. With more than half of the benefits of a universal energy subsidy essentially favoring the richest 20% of the population. By contrast, targeted cash transfers to those who are most vulnerable and in need of support mostly go to the poorest 40% of the population. Rajesh, I don't want to take more time right now in terms of introducing the topic. I think we have to find a way in which we can connect the reality of individuals, fathers and mothers feeding their family, of households, to the level of countries coping with this crisis. And ultimately, and not surprisingly, we in the United Nations believe that this is a moment that actually requires solidarity, both in terms of assisting those less able to do so at a global level, in a global economic crisis context, but also in the context of smarter, wiser policies that try to address multiple challenges at one time. The report we have released today is simply one more way of trying to sharpen the focus, but also help countries to make wise, smart, fairer choices, but also those that are, from an economic perspective, most effective. Back to you. Thank you.
Administrator, thank you so much. Just to remind you, audience, ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching around the world, some of the key points Mr. Steiner was making there: no fiscal space, no financing left, spiraling prices, mounting debt, yet there remain policy options. The window is narrow, but there are policy options that countries can take. Targeted transfers is one of those. You'll be hearing more about those later, and you can read more about those and the situation on the ground in the latest report from UNDP, which George, the chief economist from UNDP, is, I think, just about to put in the chat for you now, a link to that report, so you'll be able to download it shortly. He'll pop that in very, very shortly. We've been talking about the UNDP report. You can download it from that link that we're about to share with you in the chat box. But to convey the main points of the report, the UNDP team also prepared this short video to help as a little explainer. So engineering team, if we could have that video up now, that would be great.
Surging prices of food, energy, and fertilizer have skyrocketed since the war in Ukraine. This risks pushing at least 71 million in the developing world into poverty, a rate faster than during the COVID-19 pandemic, with hotspots in the West Balkans, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the Sahel region. Impacts are expected to be hard across all poverty lines, such as in Sierra Leone, Moldova, and Egypt. In Ethiopia and the Republic of Yemen, which hold 3/4 of the 750,000 people facing starvation, the impact could be catastrophic. As a response, many countries are raising interest rates to dampen demand, which will in turn slow down economies. But this is unlikely to lessen food and energy inflation. In the 1970s, workers demanded higher wages in response to spikes in food and energy prices, triggering a price-wage spiral that further pushed inflation. Economists today are looking at the top of the distribution, where a price-profit spiral is in the making, generating huge profits for all companies while sending the cost of living even higher. Finally, external debt and external debt payments are a 20-year high in developing countries. Governments, still reeling from the financial impact of the pandemic, now face a food and energy price shock without the resources needed to compensate poor and vulnerable households. Are we at the doorstep of a global debt crisis? Should governments tax all companies rather than suppress wages? And should they directly compensate households to offset higher prices?
Wow, spiraling prices, record debt, limited fiscal space. It's all in there in the report. What are developing world governments to do? Time to get some more detailed perspectives from around the world. I'm going to invite to the screen the speakers for our first discussion panel today. I'm going to welcome Marcel Spartari, the Minister of Labour and Social Protection of the Republic of Moldova. I'm going to also welcome Betty Miner, Cabinet Secretary in the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development of the Republic of Kenya, and Isabel Samallo, former Vice President and Foreign Minister of the Republic of Panama. I believe Ms. Samallo is joining us. If she's not here with us straight away, we'll connect her shortly. But I see my two first speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. Distinguished guests, we've just heard some dramatic figures about the cost of living crisis around the world. Before we get into the policy discussion, though, I really want to get a sense from each of you, briefly, in just a minute or two, how is this crisis unfolding in your country? What are the specific issues you're addressing, and what does it feel like on the ground for your citizens? Cabinet Secretary Maina from Kenya, perhaps you'd like to go first. What is it like on the ground for you, for your people?
Well, thank you very much. And it's really a great honor to join you this afternoon for us, I think morning for others, as we discuss this twin crisis of recovering from COVID-19 and dealing with food and energy crisis at the same time. It has had a great impact in our country. We see rising inflation, which of course affects people's purchasing power, and especially the poorest of our population. And there's a large number of those confronted by poverty. Many people, I mean, we've seen, and the numbers have clearly shown that every year we've actually started to see reversals in poverty eradication, both within the continent and other parts of the world. The fuel prices have risen by more than 55% since February 2021. Food and commodity prices have gone up by nearly 20%. And all these have great implication on production, on transport, on logistics, and therefore you see rising, prices in every sector. We import a lot of food in Kenya, cooking oil, grain, and we are all aware of the impact that the war has had, and therefore we've seen increasing in prices by more than 30%. This hits especially the urban poor, more those who live on low income, on daily wages, and live in the informal settlements. They are badly affected. Rural dwellers too, but rural dwellers sometimes it's because if they don't have to buy food, then they might at least be able to feed themselves. So we have seen, and we have recorded that at least 2 million Kenyans have sunk into poverty over the last 2 years. The government has done its best within the limited resources to support the economy in the context of COVID, but by the time the war and food crisis hits, we have very limited space. So we were able to weather COVID a lot better than the current one. So we're also going through droughts in these parts of the world, in Eastern and Southern Africa, Eastern and in the Horn of Africa, which is one of our worst decades. So this is really multiple crises at the same time.
Excellency.
And we're doing our very best to cope with it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, what a situation to be in. I want to come on to talk about how governments are responding in a little later on in the conversation. But thank you for painting a very stark picture. Fuel prices up 55%. Food, I think you said 25 to 30%. Real impact on the urban poor there. Minister Spatari from Moldova, give us a sense in your country, please, briefly again, just 1 or 2 minutes, headline numbers. What is the situation like for people on the ground there? Minister, I think you might be on mute. Is your microphone unmuted? There we go. Speak now. Oh, I think you might just have muted yourself again.
Yeah, I'm good now, I think.
Yes, we can hear you. Great. Okay, yeah. So the 2 years into virtual life, we're still getting used to mute buttons and unmute buttons. No worries. Let's focus on the cost of living crisis that Moldovans are facing. Give us a sense of the problem on the ground.
Well, Moldova is a small country, but we are facing three crises. Uh, and the situation is worsening day by day when it comes to energy prices, especially. It's hot now because it's summer, but we fear what will be in the winter because the energy price is very high now. And uh, before last winter, energy already accounted for 15% of a household expenditure. And when prices quadrupled or multiplied by four, it means that in the household budget, energy can reach up to 60% in average. Of course, there are families that are more affected, families that are less affected. And I'm speaking especially of winter period when heating and natural gas is extremely expensive. Now we have compensated for a significant part of the increase in the past winter, but we see prices further increasing. And as I said, energy prices now, natural gas prices now, are four times higher than they have been 1 year ago. And if the prices remain at this level, then we will have to compensate up to 10% of our public budget for the households. That's huge. And we will have no choice than to do this because otherwise the households will just not be able to pay for the heating during the winter period. And of course, we have rising food prices and general prices are increasing. Inflation reached 30%. So the situation is quite dramatic. Thank you.
And I want to pick up with you on a point later on. Obviously, Moldova is seeing a huge influx of Ukrainian refugees as well. So that's another intersecting crisis for you. You've got to somehow stretch existing services to support those people as you. We'll talk about how you're making that work or trying to make that work shortly. But let's speak now to Isabel San Malo from Panama, former Vice President and Foreign Minister. Great to see you. Ms. San Malo, I would love to get the sense from you of the situation there in Panama.
Well, hello. Good morning to those in this hemisphere and good evening to the rest. Thank you so much for the opportunity of sharing on this important report. As I speak, there are widespread protests in Panama in different provinces. Transportation system drivers, teachers, workers, youth, and others have turned to the streets protesting about the cost of living and the cost of fuel. These popular movements have, in recent days, forced the executive to establish dialogue tables to find different solutions to the high cost of living. The cost of the food basket in Panama registered almost 13% increase in relation to the same period in 2021. Now, we are seeing recovery after the pandemic. However, because Panama had one of the toughest lockdowns, I would say, in the region and maybe in the world, our schools were closed for 2 years full. We had a sharp consumption drop in our household, perhaps the sharpest in Latin America, and we are having a slower growth. Part of what we're seeing on the ground right now is that employment is not being recuperated at the same rate that the economy is recuperating. And we have very, very high rates of informality, almost 50% of the population is in the informal sector, which is also part of the situation when we see the cost of living and the cost of fuel increasing. Panama, we are a small country. We have some inflation, but not at the rate of other countries in the region and not at the rate of, for example, the United States, even though the US dollar is our local currency. Our inflation is about half right now of what it is at the US or other countries in the region, maybe 4.5%. When we look at the map, the poverty map that the report that has just been presented shows, we can see that Panama actually appears as the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean which still has a low impact on poverty in comparison to other countries as a result of the rising prices. So that is positive. What policies is our government implementing similar to other countries? Fuel subsidies, cash transfers, which were put in place during the pandemic, are still valid. So, in conclusion, what are Panamanians facing right now? Unemployment, informality, limited growth, sharp increases in the cost of food and the cost of energy. It does not seem that critical when we compare ourselves to other countries, but I want to point out, and with this I will finish, that Panama is a country that has experienced very long-term prosperity for over a decade, very high growth levels. So people are struggling with what's happening right now because it's very different from what we've seen for the past decade. Panamanians are not really accustomed to this reality, and this presents very, very important governance challenges for the government. Next year is a pre-electoral year, and we can expect additional governance challenges as a result of these increases in the cost of living.
Great, super interesting. Thank you, Isabel Samala. You mentioned their protest on the street. I mean, let's not forget that prices, basic commodities and real necessities like food and energy can often lead to instability as well. So we may come on to talk about that. But you all, thank you so much for painting really stark pictures. You all talked about crises that are overlapping with other crises. You all mentioned that, COVID, you're still dealing with COVID. I mean, let's not forget that the pandemic hasn't left us yet, even if many countries have started to move on from the pandemic. But in Kenya, you talked about food insecurity and drought. In Moldova, you talked about energy, food prices, and then also we mentioned the refugee influx as well. In Panama, I believe a country that imports food and energy. You feel like you've been slightly insulated because of high growth in recent years, but let's remember that we may be at the beginning of really major food and energy price spirals as well. So what are the policy choices that you have to make, and how do you start making the decisions about what to prioritize when you have complicated overlapping crises? What are some of the things that you've been able to do that you feel that maybe others could learn from that you'd like to share? Isabel Samala, you talked about targeted transfers. Let me give the microphone to the other speakers first of all. Maybe we'll come back to you to talk about that. Betty Maina from Kenya, would you care to share with us what are some of the measures that you think the government's been taking that are starting or could help to address these overlapping crises?
Well, thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, there was quite a bit of investment in supporting and stimulating the economy during COVID. And one of those things that was done also for people is to focus and support cash transfer, especially to vulnerable families, aged and vulnerable households. And as I've mentioned earlier as well, we've been having drought. So one of the things that the government also invests in is increasing the distribution of relief food. But even that is really supported by the cash transfer program. We've also supported enhanced productivity, especially for livestock areas because of the drought. So there was a government program to purchase frail livestock, but right now we are also working with those communities to restock once the drought lifts. The economy showed a lot of resilience during COVID, but that resilience and that's something that is quite appreciated. Some sectors have done fairly well. There was agriculture did bounce back, but it's not every sector. It's and a lot of it relies like tourism was badly affected by COVID, and that is a great market for agriculture. So depressed tourism also depresses agriculture. So those are some of the ways in which we've been dealing with it, stimulating the economy and supporting vulnerable households and vulnerable people with at least some basic income support.
Realistically, how long could you go on supporting the economy, though?
Not very long. The fiscal space is fairly tight, and it's not just tight in our country. It's tight everywhere. Where the impact of the war in Ukraine has meant that some of our traditional partners are also focusing on supporting themselves. So even foreign assistance that the country used to get is that is reducing. So we don't have enough space to support and to keep giving, all these transfers, but it is something that must still be done. So there has to be balancing of government budgets and a reflection on reorganizing expenditure.
Interesting. And Minister Spatari, this is something that you mentioned in your comments, so why don't I bring you in here? What are you focusing on? How are you kind of managing to prop up the economy, or how long can that go on? Tell us a little bit more. Minister Spatari, can you hear us?
Am I unmuted? I'm never
You're
sure.
unmuted now. Yeah,
All right.
yeah, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
As I said, our government has compensated for the energy price increase last winter, everyone directly in the invoice for a significant part of the energy price increase. And we are currently developing, with the support of UNDP, a specific program, a new mechanism, in order to provide more targeted but also differentiated support for the consumers during the next winter. And this support will also be provided directly in the invoices, so that we avoid, all the administrative burden and the bureaucracy and the people queuing for applications and so on. So the support will be offered directly in the invoices, but the mechanism, the information system that we will put in place will not solve the problem on itself. You still have to spend a lot of money, even if you spend the money more targeted or more efficiently. So the cost of the intervention last year was 2.5% of our GDP. Of our public spending, which is roughly 1% of our GDP. But for the next winter season, with the current prices, we could go up to 10% of our public budget. And we will have to take this money from development, from infrastructure, investment, from other systems. And we, of course, count on the support of international partners. Some of the Western countries in Europe have already pledged some support for Moldova for the next winter period. And we will ensure that these resources are spent efficiently and targeted. But the challenge is quite big. Of course, we have other measures that we put in place. We increased the minimum pension, almost doubled it in the past year. We have implemented a reform of the minimum income mechanism, because we have a poverty reduction program that is focused to the most vulnerable, and we have also reformed this system with the support of World Bank this year. So there are many challenges. Of course, the presence of the refugees in Moldova adds up on top of these challenges. We currently have 3% of our population composed of refugees, and every eighth child in our country is a refugee child. We have more than 40,000 refugee children in our country, which makes up for 10% of our educational system capacity. So integrating them during autumn in the schools will be a huge challenge and a costly endeavor as well. So yeah, we are preparing the mechanisms, but the mechanisms will not pay for themselves. And Moldova is a poor country with limited fiscal space, as other countries participating in this panel. And if we intend to develop and to join the European family, as you know, Moldova is a candidate country for joining the EU, then we must converge and we must make investments. Hopefully, this energy crisis is temporary, and we have to at least pass this winter.
And Minister, you talked about increasing pensions, correct?
Exactly, we doubled the minimum pension, and just for you to understand, 60% of our retired persons now earn a minimum pension.
Right. Okay. So a pension is it means tested in Moldova?
Now it's contributions based, but on top of the pension system, we have a minimum income scheme, which is means tested.
Okay. All right. The reason I'm asking is that I'm thinking about Betty Maina talked about this, Isabel Samala talked about this, about transfers, putting more money in people's pockets and letting them decide how best to spend that money because they know what their needs are better. It seems like you're doing a little bit of the same thing as well there in Moldova. And that's certainly something that the UNDP report highlights as a more cost-effective and equitable solution to the current cost of living crisis than things like propping up subsidies or using interest rates to target inflation. Speakers, we have about 9 to 10 minutes left. There are a few questions I really want to get to. I want to talk about the issue of debt. You've all talked about international partners, and many international partners are now kind of like looking after themselves a little bit more, which may be reasonable, may not be reasonable. That's for a different conversation. But I want to talk about, many developing countries face existing high levels of debt. I think I read somewhere that developing countries currently have their highest levels of debt for 50 years, according to the World Bank. We've also seen that the pandemic had a disruptive impact on global supply chains and on debt levels too. Borrowing costs from capital markets are skyrocketing, fiscal space, as you've all told us, is dwindling, and some of the multilateral initiatives, such as the G20's common framework, don't seem to be working. So how are you dealing, or what is your approach, or what is your thinking in your countries, government, to how you're going to deal with debt crises? Or what is the debt crisis that's facing you, or how are you going to seek to expand your liquidity in the coming years to deal with the growing problem? I'm going to throw that open. Who'd like to go first with that question?
I can jump in.
I could.
Betty Maina, why don't you go first, and then Isabel Samala will come to you.
Okay. Yeah, debt is an issue. Debt, we have seen an increase in our debt, both foreign and domestic debt, and that's can be a big issue. And you can pick up a lot of that in the debates in the media here. But the last analysis by the IMF in December last year showed that our public debt is still quite sustainable, though it could lead to there could be some risk of debt distress. Now, part of it is because we're very susceptible. We're a small economy too, though a large economy in East Africa, but we rely a lot on exports, and that when exports don't do well, then we really do have a bit of a challenge. So one of the things we're working on is still fixing it by increasing production and focusing more and more on diversifying. the exports. Quite a bit of our money has been spent on infrastructure, and obviously those are decisions that can be made to back, no, to decrease some spending or to pace the spending on projects, because that can be controlled. Though, of course, we require this infrastructure in order to support production. So it's all a question of balancing. We can't really wrap up more debt. It is controlled by the constitution, and there's a role for parliament in it. So though we are not in distress yet, we are clearly watching it very, very carefully. Thank you.
Can I just quickly follow up on that, Ms. Maina? You talked about diversifying exports, but how is that going to alleviate your balance of payments problems or your fiscal problems when global economies are slowing down? We may be heading into a global recession. Demand for exports is going to slow down. What are you going to do then? Briefly, if you don't mind. Just wanted to follow up on that question.
No, governments can't stop trying. That, I think, is a point to make. When you're responsible for governance in this matter, then obviously you must keep trying. The global economy is fairly interconnected, as we have seen with the food and energy crisis. So there would still be opportunities, because we produce a lot of things that are consumed, though it is not high value all the time, but it is significant part of our exports is food, and it's food into Europe and other places during the winter months. So we must clearly focus on increasing those type of exports, because there will always be a market for food.
Okay. Thanks for responding to that. Isabel Samalo, let's address the debt issue for you in Panama.
Well, the debt is an issue in Panama. Fiscal space is an issue. I would not say it's our biggest issue. We have a very delicate crisis, for example, with our social security system, which, if not addressed, will represent a huge risk regarding our finances in general and our debt. The issue with debt in Panama is that because, as I mentioned, we grew so much. I would say that we had double digit growth for over a decade consistently in our country. So that large growth is what mostly supported our fiscal space and our possibility to increase debt. That debt was supported by high growth. As the growth has been diminishing, our fiscal space has diminished, and there is less possibility of investing in infrastructure, which was the biggest driver for the growth. So it's like a vicious circle. We had the expansion of the Panama Canal. We built a first line of the metro, a second line of the metro, and this really drove our growth and our employment, particularly. As growth decelerates and we have fiscal constraints, the country no longer has the possibility of the large infrastructure projects as we did before. What has the government done? This government has introduced interesting legislation for public-private partnerships to try to attract investments and the private sector supporting the infrastructure projects that we still need. The issue with Panama, which is not different from for the rest of Latin America, we have a very low tax system. We are about half of OECD averages, Latin America in general, and Panama as well. So that does not support the budget too much. Our budget depends very much on a very large income support from the Panama Canal, which has allowed us to build and do many things accompanying, debt and financing. As we move forward into the future, we need to address at some point consensus building and national agreements that allow us to take difficult decisions such as tax reform, difficult decisions such as how are we going to finance the social security those are hard decisions. Are we going to increase the age? Are we going to increase uh, um, the, the the percentages of contribution to your pension? We also, because having said all of this, we have the dollar and we continue to grow, we attract migrants. So we have people from Colombia, from Venezuela, from Central America that come to our country, and this also puts pressure on unemployment and will force us in the near future to look at policy changes that require national consensus to address inequality and address our fiscal situation, very much dependent, as I mentioned, in the Panama Canal income, for example.
Okay. What I'm hearing from both Isabel San-Malo and Betty Miner so far is there is such a dependency on the globalized economy and global economies for the future success or the ability to lift countries out of the situations that they are in. And that feels like it's on a bit of a knife edge for countries. Minister Spatari, give us the view from Moldova as a country that wants to be more part of Europe, but is also, as you just said, seen its population increase by 3% in 3 months, which is crazy. How are you tackling or dealing with the issue of liquidity on the financial on the international markets for Moldova?
Well, our public deficit is not that big, and I think we have the capacity to absorb some more debts. But in the same time, our Ministry of Finance is very careful, and sure, we are ready to engage debts on development, but when it comes to short-term intervention, uh, well, we see the risk as being rather regional, and engaging debts for paying compensations it's a bit dangerous for the long term. At least this is the view of the Ministry of Finance. And when it comes to the refugees, the presence of the refugees in our country is certainly a challenge, and it is also costly. But we are supported by international organizations. UNHCR is here, World Food Program, UNICEF, and many other partners, and they are implementing support scheme, including cash grants to refugees and to host families. And we have opened the labor market to the refugees. We allowed refugee children to attend classes in schools. We have also provided classrooms equipped with computers for distance learning because, well, they have to attend their Ukrainian classes. We are adapting. I think we need to increase the absorption capacity because Moldova has enjoyed a good level of international, attention, and many Western countries turned towards us and are willing to support us. So we have to ensure that we put in place the mechanisms and the capacities to absorb the support that is coming towards Moldova, and also have to be very transparent in what mechanisms we are putting in place and how we are absorbing this the external aid that is coming to us. Well, all in all, while the situation is really, really challenging, I think we are optimistic. We have the support of Europe. We are a very small country, and Europe is a powerful union. So on 15th of July, we go to Bucharest, to Romania, to a donors conference where we will present our case and hopefully will receive the support of European nations.
Okay, Minister, thank you for that. I'm glad you said that you feel optimistic. I hope we can all take that feeling from this conversation. Two more brief questions, panelists, and then I'll let you go. You've all mentioned international partners, so that's going to be my last question. What is the role of the international community? But there's a really interesting question that's come in from one of our audience members. Dima Al-Khatib has asked, how do the speakers see the engagement of the private sector to alleviate the impacts of the current crises that we're facing? I'd love to kind of get a quick response from you all on that, and then focus on for the last question about the role of the international community. So, Betty Miner, you talked about expanding exports. I'm wondering if you want to start by responding to this question about the role of engaging the private sector. How do you see that as a way to help alleviate the impacts of the current cost of living crisis?
Thank you. Kenya firmly believes in the role of the private sector in development and has a very robust private sector. We're a country without many natural resources, so we've had to rely a lot on the enterprise of our people and medium enterprises and large enterprises, and remains quite open in that regard. Is open both for development, open for public policy dialogue, but even like Panama has mentioned, in seeking to address the infrastructure issues, for instance, we are also turning a lot to the private sector for that support. So I consider, and we consider the private sector critical in working with government in these responses, adopting and using the private sector for even some of the solutions on delivery of public services. Mobile money is utilized in cash transfer quite a bit. So those are the partnerships that we really encourage and will continue to work with.
Okay, briefly, same question to Isabel Sanmalo and Marcel Sbatari.
Sure. I already mentioned public-private partnerships, and yes, I believe in the future that is very necessary. We can no longer depend solely on government spending to finance the infrastructure gaps that the underdeveloped world has in general. We need public-private partnerships to ensure that there are mechanisms that allow the private sector to do these investments without governments having to uh, put up put out the money initially. That's one thing. On a broader scale, I think we need to address the issue of partnerships. The Sustainable Development Goals will not be achieved unless we have the private sector as a larger partner to development than we have seen so far. And when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, partnerships is a very important objective that 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 has a role of a cross-cutting issue across all of the 17 objectives. We need to find ways. There are already new mechanisms that are being explored and in place. For example, in the financial sector, we're seeing more and more climate bonds, gender bonds, social bonds that are put out as fresh resources, particularly geared towards specific areas. So that's one thing. But other than the financial sector, we have seen, but still limited, things like private corporations incorporating within their agenda profit with purpose. How do we go about profit with purpose? How do we engage our stakeholders? What are companies doing in terms of climate, energy saving, water saving? What are they doing in order to incorporate their communities as stakeholders, their employees are as stakeholders? What are they doing to for social impact? I mean, there's so much out there that can be done in terms of the private sector playing a very large role in development. And I think more
Okay,
and more we're seeing clearly that this cannot be two separate agendas: the agenda of
okay.
profit and the agenda of development. It's one
I think
agenda.
we'd all agree. Yeah, I think we would all agree with you there, Isabel Samuel. I'm just going to have to wind you up a little bit there, just with an eye on the clock. And I want a quick comment on private sector, 30 seconds, Marcel Spatari. And then I do want 1 minute each for speakers, only 1 minute, on what you want the international community to do that's going to help your country respond and address this cost of living crisis. Marcel Spatari, 30 seconds on private sector. I'm sure you're going to agree with our other speakers about the importance of the role of the private sector, but I'm going to give you 30 seconds to just to elaborate on that.
Well, I will take 1 minute and a half to answer both questions, and we'll save a bit of time for the transitions. And 10 seconds out of this to send greetings to Dima Al-Khatib, who is a UNDP resident representative in Moldova. And we count on the support of UNDP in our country. Look, the private sector had the possibility to support the government through direct donations into a specific account that was opened by the Ministry of Finance for the refugee crisis. So we now finance all the shelters for refugees from these sources. So that's a tremendous support. The private sector can, of course, open shelters for refugees on their own, but they also can contribute funds for the government-run shelters. So that's on the private sector, additional to what was said. And then what do we want from the international community? To attend the meeting in Bucharest on 15th of July, where Moldova will present its case, and hopefully we will find solutions together. Thank you.
Okay, Isabel Samalo, Betty Maina, 1 minute each, please, maximum, on what's the one thing, what's your call to action for the international community, the forums like the G20, for example. What does your country need from those groupings of wealthy, powerful nations to help alleviate the cost of living crisis?
Can I go back to what was mentioned at the beginning of this panel, development emergency? So if not now, when? What would I expect? Capacities are differentiated from the north and the south. So the response needs to be differentiated. How? Financial resources for the global south, lessons learned, knowledge, sharing knowledge, and definitely foreign direct investment. I think that the recipe it's perhaps nothing new. What needs to be new and different is how much we support that development in order to respond to what is an emergency, particularly for the global south.
Okay, Betty Maina.
Thank you. Coming from Africa, one of the things that we would like to emphasize is that the international community must stand with Africa. It's a continent that is growing, has had various crises, and some of the current one, for instance, like drought, is something that requires our attention, even in the context of other crises like in Ukraine. Kenya has strong partnerships. UNDP is a strong partner here and coordinates the other parties, but they would also have noted that there is some decline in development or support, and it's something that we mustn't forget. There are needs everywhere, and no one need is is different or more superior than the other, and therefore keeping a great focus on supporting Africa's aspirations, supporting Africa's integration efforts, and also opening up markets for Africa's products, with fair trade terms is a critical. It's a critical requirement of this solidarity. Thank you very much.
Okay. Speakers, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom and some policy ideas and options from your different parts of the world. Betty Maina from Kenya, Isabel Samalo from Panama, Marcel Spatari from Moldova. Thank you so much for joining us today. for this conversation. I'm going to let you all go. And while our first panelists sign off and our next speakers get set up, let me remind you that you can download the new report from UNDP. It's called Addressing the Cost of Living Crisis in Developing Countries. It's available if you, on your screens and the top box, the question and answer box, if you click the other tab for handouts, you'll see the link to access the report right there. You can download it. As we've heard, the report estimates that some 71 million people in developing countries have been forced into poverty in just the last 3 months as a result of food and energy prices surging, resulting from the Ukraine war. It also calculates record profits to oil companies this year as a result of energy price rises, all while developing country government debt is at a record high and countries are still reeling from COVID. So with all that in mind, I think it's time to turn our attentions to the global community. We've heard from the countries we've spoken to already about the interconnectedness of their economies into the world. So what do fora like the G20, the UN system, the World Bank and IMF, what are they doing and not doing about the cost of living crisis? What is the best way to reduce inflation all over the world? How can developing countries respond to their citizens' growing needs as well as managing their own record debt burdens? And how can the world reconcile record fossil fuel subsidies with the need to phase out coal and fossil fuels because of the climate emergency? So for this conversation, that'll take us to the end of our time together today. I'm joined by Azucena Abeleche, who's the Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay, and she's also the current chair of the Development Committee of the Board of Governors of the IMF and the World Bank. And we also welcome back UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. Distinguished guests, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Minister Abeleche, let me start with you. I'd love to get a sense from you that as the current chair of the Development Committee for the World Bank and the IMF, and as the Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay, you're wearing two hats. You also have an inside track on some of the global economy's most important debates. I really want to start with you talking about inflation. We're seeing this everywhere, all over the world. You know, Uruguay, as many emerging markets, is also grappling with the issue right now. What do you think works and what doesn't work? And what's your Ministry of Finance most worried about? And then with your World Bank IMF hat on, when you look at central banks, is the medicine, which is in this case rising interest rates, is it worse than the sickness of rising inflation? Over to you. Welcome.
I have to unmute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. Before addressing the question about Uruguay, let me say a few words about the current difficult international economic context, touching upon several issues that were discussed in the panel previously. So we are facing right now a series of negative shocks that are impacting the global economy, hitting, as was said at the beginning, most the vulnerable. So I would say we are coping with four overlapping crises. First of all, public health. Second, food inflation and food insecurity. Third, high debt burdens. And fourth, climate change crisis. So while many countries are emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic, the unequal access to vaccines in many countries means that the new waves and variants of the virus can derail their fledgling recoveries at any time. Second, the war on Ukraine has led to the loss of life and human suffering, and also the displacement of millions of people, something that we do have discussed within the Development Committee. It has further weakened overall economic prospects. The sharp escalation in the prices of food and energy, compounded by disruption in supply chain induced by the pandemic, are weakening food systems and setting back poverty alleviation efforts. Third, we have higher costs for fertilizers, production constraints for crops, trade restriction, and other climate change-related events such as droughts. So all of this is threatening global food security. So where do governments stand in this situation? We have limited capacity to cope with this current situation. We have limited capacity to react to this string of economic shocks. So, and this is the case because we have provided a massive fiscal stimulus to save, first of all, lives, but also jobs during the last 2 years and a half of the pandemic. As was said, as we heard earlier in the United Nations Development Program report, most developing countries are focused on providing sizable short-term relief to poor and most vulnerable households at a moment when many of them are struggling with rising debt service payments and tightening international financial conditions. Given the scale of the challenges ahead and the degree of uncertainty prevailing, strengthening international cooperation is needed more than ever to deliver global public goods. And this is something very important and we are responsible as policymakers, as authorities in the different institutions, multilateral institutions. So these public global goods include health preparedness and ready access to vaccines, mitigating food insecurity and displacement, and addressing climate change. So let me now go to the case of Uruguay. In the case of our country, in Uruguay, we have taken, I would say, an holistic approach to face the current surge in food and energy prices, but also while healing the scars from the pandemic. So this has been done by different instruments. First of all, softening the impact on purchasing power to ensure social cohesion, while at the same time promoting fiscal sustainability by addressing expenditure efficiency. And in addition, increasing investment to boost long-term potential growth and keeping our sights on advancing structural reforms. So many things at the same time. First, the country entered the pandemic with a robust social safety net and large administrative capillarity, allowing to target vulnerable households based on administrative records of potential beneficiaries. New policies were rolled out to protect household welfare and human capital through direct income transfers and expanded unemployment and health insurance. Second, over the last 2 years, we secured the necessary public savings to provide well-targeted support to firms, households, and the most vulnerable, while prudently balancing fiscal sustainability objectives. This allowed meeting all three pillars of the new fiscal rule for 2 years in a row, restoring fiscal credibility in the midst of a global pandemic. To mute the impact of inflationary pressures on real wages or to decrease the impact, I would say, of inflationary pressures on real wages, we have deployed targeted and time-bound cash transfers. We also budgeted in an increase in public sector wages, linking the pace of nominal wage growth of public servants to future economic growth, aligning budget needs to revenue potential. In addition, we have also lowered import tariffs on key staple goods and transparently tempered the pass-through of international oil prices on domestic fuel prices. As a third pillar of this holistic approach, over the last 2 years, and despite the COVID-19 outbreak, the government has moved forward with I would say, a very ambitious agenda of fiscal and structural and other structural reforms, I would say, managing the crisis always with a long-term view. We made progress in passing legislation and advancing measures to include a new fiscal framework to strengthen fiscal discipline, developing a blueprint to reform the pension system, introducing a new governance to increase the efficiency of state-owned enterprises, and in the case of Uruguay, these are an important part of our economy, and taking an expansive view on international trade, seeking trade integration beyond our current trade bloc, which is the Mercosur. So I would leave the answer here to continue with our dialogue.
Minister, there is a lot to unpack there. Thank you so much. I sort of wish we had until 9:30 now, but Achim Steiner from UNDP, a lot of our speakers today have talked about direct transfers, targeted transfers, and the UNDP report talks about them as well. Yet, when it comes to tackling things like inflation, we do see that subsidies are often the default option for politicians. Are they the best solution?
Well, as always, Rajesh, I think the way that we look at the opportunities that exist for short-term policy measures and their longer-term impacts clearly don't necessarily equally divide into subsidies are good or subsidies are bad. Just like debt in itself is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. We have heard a lot today about the challenge of countries facing extraordinary levels of indebtedness. I think we are at a point where in this crisis that we are witnessing right now, we have to go back to some fundamental design principles. And I think as Minister Arbeleccia just laid out, a government that looks at this in a systemic and holistic way is first of all more likely to succeed in actually being able to use limited resources to deal with a series of problems that, taken individually, almost seem insurmountable. I think what we have also learned in economics has time and again shown us that, for example, subsidies can be a very blunt instrument. So in the context of the current extraordinary increase in energy prices, it is to me surprising how easily we are defaulting back into fossil fuel subsidies at the most, let's say, blunt level. And this is true not just in developing countries, it's just as true in developed nations that are currently pivoting into either tax measures that essentially go across the entire consumer spectrum or indeed subsidies. As the report that we have released today has shown, long term or even in the medium term, these very often are not sustainable from a public budget perspective. And Minister Arbeleccia, I think, will also perhaps comment later on this, because Uruguay is also an example of tackling the short-term crisis that we face now with an economic transition and a green transition, for instance, in its transport sector. I was just in Uruguay a couple of weeks ago and fascinated to see how you are looking at your public transport infrastructure from the point of view of moving to an electrification program, because it actually makes economic sense, macroeconomic sense. It's a better way to spend public money to electrify the public bus fleet, for instance, or rather public transport that is run by a number of private transport companies, because in the long term, for the national economy, given the price of fuels, this is actually a more rational step to take. So we need to, first of all, look at where do we target those kinds of subsidies. And a key part of what we have heard also from the previous panel is how do you identify those who are in most need? How do you also reach them? And certainly COVID has taught us a great deal with digital technology, with our ability to obtain data, that we can target much more the measures that we deploy in order to make a crisis more manageable. And I think here the question of cash transfers, temporary basic incomes is an extremely important tool. We have seen them deployed across dozens of countries during COVID-19. Many economic orthodoxies were simply thrown out of the window because it was the only way to move forward. And interestingly enough, the world discovered that actually sometimes targeted cash transfers are a highly effective way of, first of all, absorbing the shock, but also of not spending money on those who do not need it, or, as subsidies can often be, regressive. I mentioned earlier on that our report estimates that when you look at energy subsidies, more than half of the benefits of a universal energy subsidy actually favors the richest 20% of the population, which is really by far the opposite, because cash transfers would then go mostly to the poorest 40% of the population. So I think, Rajesh, these are moments in which, as we have heard from Moldova to Kenya to Panama and now Uruguay, where whether you are a nation in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, Asia, or anywhere else, each reality will differ, but I think there are lessons that are being learned. And one of the roles of UNDP and the United Nations family, as it is with our sister agency, the Bretton Woods Institution, is to quickly help countries access good analysis, best practices, and develop more policy choices so that informed decisions can be taken.
Okay, Mr. Steiner, thank you so much. You raised some really interesting points there. And audience, we mentioned at the beginning that Mr. Steiner was having a few technical difficulties. That's why we're trying to work on his camera so that we can actually see him speak as well. And he doesn't look like he's in witness protection program at the moment, but we'll bear with it. What I noticed is that not being able to see you actually makes us focus on what you're saying even more. And that was really interesting. Minister Arbeleche, let me pick up on some of this with you. Because Uruguay is a really interesting case study. Am I right in thinking that 94% of your electricity is clean electricity? So you're kind of managing to walk the talk on energy transitions. We've talked about subsidies as being default options, but actually they're not as equitable or cost effective as transfers in terms of a way to spend public finances. But how have you got over the difficult politics of removing fuel subsidies to get on track with energy transition in your country? I think a lot of countries could learn a lot from that.
So, yes, thank you very much. Maybe I should switch off the camera so that people can focus more on what I'm saying. But
let's not go that far. Let's not go that far.
Okay. So first of all, and this is like linking to Akim's previous reply. I think that as policymakers, one thing that we must do all the time is not to lose sight of the medium-term priorities as we deal with the short-term shocks, whether it is inflation or whether it is COVID-19 pandemic, whatever it is that we are facing, we do need to keep the high beam headlights on. So I think that is something that we have done, and that's why one of the reasons why we have been also having in mind the green agenda, I would say, or the environmental agenda. So yes, indeed, Uruguay has been at the forefront in the transition to clean energy and conservation of natural resources. Over the past 30 years, national policies enabled Uruguay to cut greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And I would say that we are decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions. Today, Uruguay is one of the leading countries in the world in terms of sustainable electricity production, and we are currently launching the country's second energy transition based on green hydrogen. Achieving climate change mitigation, as I said at the beginning, is a key global public good. So sorry, I'm running out of battery, so maybe, yes, you won't see me or hear me. So let's check. Okay. So just let me check that I'm not, for some reason, maybe we have to press there. Okay.
We can
maybe
still
we
hear
have.
and see. We can still hear and see you. I hope that's not a reflection on the energy policy. By any
Okay.
chance.
No, yes, it's something on my part that I'm doing wrong for sure. So
okay. Let me pick up on a point with you actually while I have you, while we had this natural break in the conversation, just with one eye on time as well. We talked about debt. We've talked about kind of subsidies. What I understand is that Uruguay has an environmentally linked bond, doesn't it, that raises money on capital markets and links that ability to raise money on capital markets to your performance on climate targets and nature preservation. So that's sort of like killing two birds with one stone. That's kind of achieving two goals with one tool. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that we are not there yet. So.
Okay, I think we're having some technical gremlins here with Minister Arbeleche. We have lost contact with her momentarily. I can't hear her any longer. Achim Steiner, while I still have you.
I'm still here, Rajesh.
Great. No one wants to hear me just talk till the top of the hour. So let me pick up with you as well then. We've talked about debt problems that many developing countries are facing. Highest levels of debt in 50 years, according to the World Bank. And the IMF estimates that 60% of low-income economies are in debt distress already, meaning that they'll have trouble making their debt payments month to month, at a situation where liquidity is a problem. There are huge constraints on what budgets they have left. Given the latest analysis from UNDP, to what extent do you worry that we may be at the doorstep of a global debt crisis? And what should and could the international community do about that?
Thank you, Rajesh, for raising that. And without getting into too much complexity, let me first of all say, yes, we are rapidly sliding into a debt crisis. But I just want to preface my remarks that what I alluded to earlier on, that debt crisis is not, in a sense, an inevitability. This is not a mathematical formula. It has a lot to do with how we manage debt. And I want to go back to Minister Spaltari from Moldova. He said something that really struck me, a note of optimism in the midst of this crisis. And why? Because Moldova, as a small nation, can look to the larger Europe as being, in a sense, a part of its solution, a part of its own safety net. And I think this is an extremely important message. We can manage debt. We can manage the current level of indebtedness, but not with the way in which we are currently managing the crisis and our international financial system. Let me briefly point out, the world today has over $450 trillion in global wealth. In the last few years, we have seen that the financial system, the hedge funds, the banks, and so on, have struggled to find a way in which to actually invest this capital. And yet here we are in the midst of an extraordinary crisis following COVID, now with all the three food, fuel, and finance crises, bringing the kind of impacts we heard throughout this session. We have to introduce urgently a level of liquidity into the global economy. We have to help individual countries to have access to liquidity in order to be able to manage that. Some of that must come from the international financial system. We have international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods system that we set up. Just like Moldova can look to the European Union, I think we now need to empower also our international institutions to be that safety net, that solidarity lever that we can pull in moments of need. And we are failing. If you go back to the spring meetings that took place just a few weeks ago in Washington of the IMF and the World Bank, the members of these institutions were not able to respond adequately to the extraordinary need for liquidity. So what we are seeing right now, and I think this will unfold in the coming weeks and months, is a number of countries probably defaulting on their debt, with all the catastrophic consequences that this has. We could actually do something about this. First of all, we could put more paid-in capital by the members into the multilateral development banks. We could revisit their capital adequacy rules, i.e. how much capital can they borrow, because these are very strict limitations right now, and many argue that they are too low. But we also need to look at debt in terms of who owes what to whom. For the first time in a long time, the majority of the debt that is currently owed is actually private sector debt. So also the private sector here, you referred to it earlier on in a national context. What we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was, in a sense, a perverse impact of the IMF and the World Bank putting up liquidity, but the rating agencies essentially punishing a country for taking advantage of those facilities. So only 2 countries took actually advantage of some of those credit lines, even though they were desperately looking for financing to deal with the pandemic. We have to bring the private sector to the table here. It has to play a role. This goes from the credit agencies to the way that we also look at those who intermediate the global finance. And we have to deal with debt relief. It is urgent right now, and it could easily be done. We did it during COVID for a limited period of 6 months, a debt service suspension initiative. And we need to extend it to all developing countries, not just to LDCs. We need to look at which countries are in debt distress, and we need to make this part of a breathing space, if you want, in which perhaps for the next 2 years we suspend the servicing of debt in order to create the fiscal space, as we heard from our ministers and colleagues, that countries need right now in order to stand up a response, the kind of smart policy response that allow us to deal with price shocks, but do not pivot back to a fossil fuel economy that simply uses blunt instruments that erode fiscal space even more and set us back on something that we have to move forward on. So in a relatively small nutshell, but with many complex issues, Rajesh, UNDP's appeal, the appeal of the Secretary General and many of the experts is, We need to respond right now, and we need the G20, the wealthier nations that make up 80% of the global economy, to step up and not step back, including on the financing of development funds. It is really a bitter experience for many developing countries to see some of the wealthiest nations cut their ODA at this very moment. These are the wrong policy responses, the wrong reflexes, and that is why our work, why our session today also is focusing on the cost of living crisis, not as some sort of charity debate, but rather as a foundation on which we need to build a way forward out of this crisis, and we can only do it together. And again, I mentioned Moldova's comment. We have an international system that is here precisely for these crises. But if the wealthiest nations do not support that system to function right now, then we're doing exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing at this moment.
Okay, Achim Steiner, thank you so much. Some really great points there. I'm just keeping an eye on time. We have got Minister Abeleche back. So, Minister, in just 1 minute, I want to know, I think you heard quite a lot of what Administrator Steiner was saying there. I want to know what you can take back with your IMF and World Bank hat on. What can you take back to that fora? Achim Steiner was talking about debt relief, debt servicing suspension, more paid in capital, just greater solidarity from the global community to understand that the needs of developing countries are actually going to be a global problem, not just a problem for developing countries as well. What from that, in 1 minute, can you take back to that international forum?
Okay, thank you. I left with a question about environment. Now I jump into this other question. I think
it's all connected. We're not hanging around. It's all connected.
It is all connected, and it is clear that what we do need is cooperation amongst the different institutions, amongst the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, and again, something that I always say to the different institutions, as policymakers, we have to make responsible and judgeful decisions in what we do. So we have to hear recommendations, but at the end of the day, we countries have to have our own agendas and be responsible for what we do and what we implement. So I would say in a nutshell, two concepts. First, that each country is responsible of its own agenda. We have differences, we have particularities, and those differences have to be taken into account. And the second one, that we do need cooperation amongst the different institutions and responsibility that goes beyond the today. Sometimes we hear recommendations that are from these institutions that are not looking at the years to come. The policymakers or the governments, we countries need to have this long perspective. So it's difficult to say something not looking at the long-term perspective. We have there are, as I said at the beginning, there are global public goods that, with own national interest, we cannot provide enough of these global public goods. So it's necessary for the world to be connected. So we have to work together to deliver these global public goods, whether it's about health, whether it's about food security, or whether it's about environment.
Okay, Minister, thank you so much. I think if the UN, if the global system exists for one thing, it's to provide global public goods and help people. I think that's the point you're making. And I think that's the point that is well taken and is a really good place for us to wrap up our conversation today. Apologies, audience, for the technical problems we've encountered in this session, but I think you'd agree that the content of the session was really spectacular. Some really great points made. Minister Arbeleche, I'm going to thank you first of all for joining us. A really great case study, and you've worn both hats as well. So thank you so much for bringing that to our conversation today. Administrator Steiner, thank you so much for bearing with the technical issues you faced as well, but also for that really forceful intervention at the end there. And audience, thank you for your questions and for your comments in the chat. As I said before, you can download the UNDP report on the handouts tab, and it's also going to be available on the UNDP's website as well, I'm sure. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you the very best in dealing with this cost of living crisis wherever you are, and the best for